Hello and welcome to another SkaredCast tactical video. I'm Skary, your grateful host, wearing my ITC Polish shirt. That's right, and today we're looking at how to play Mission 3 of the ITC in every single different deployment. So sit down and enjoy the tactical show.
The Dark Kin.
Okay, so for anybody who hasn't seen one of these videos before, it's a Patreon exclusive. I talk about the mission. Mission number 3 is called Nexus Control. 4 objectives on the table. And we're going to go through each different deployment style and sort of how I would tackle the mission at hand. So let's dive in to the first. So what I'll do is, instead of going deployment in order, I'm going to use essentially the deployments very similar. So I'm going to start with like Dawn of War and then Pointy Dawn of War, and then I'll do Hammer and Anvil, then Pointy Hammer and Anvil, then I'll do Table Quarters and Spearhead. So there'll be a variety of different deployment styles, so stay tuned. If you really like it, I've had good feedback with this series, and this is the 3rd of 6 different missions. So let's take a look at Mission 3. So we're going to start with our first deployment type, which will be Spearhead Assault. So something I like to call Pointy, Hammer, and Anvil. So the deployment is pretty simple. 12 inches up from here, and then it's 9 inches from the middle, which is 36 inches, which happens to be 27 inches up. And therefore, you start and you have a sort of a pointy deployment similar to this, which is essentially a very aggressive deployment up this way. But what this deployment does, and we have spoken about it in our deployment series and in our mission series, is it creates a lot of space between the two sides, and there's not as much room between the 2 points, the 2 tips. Now, in Nexus Control, which is this mission specifically, the main aim is to, essentially in ITC, you're trying to do either capture objectives or kill stuff. There's not really much of a, difference in terms of strategy and tactics. You either have to try and hold more, or kill. Okay, and we're back. We've set up the deployments. You want to kill or hold, or kill or hold. Now the bonus in this objective is to hold all 4 of the objectives. Now when you're in this deployment, it's going to be kind of hard to control either of the ones that are right in your opponent's deployment zone. However, you have to be relatively aggressive to really hold the objective. So if you're playing a very aggressive army like Space Wolves, or something that wants to get in your face like Blood Angels, or Alpha Legion, or Raven Guard that has a free move, you can actually get into a position where you're controlling most of the objectives right off the gate and force your opponent on the backfield. An army like mine that has lots of Talos likes to get into a zone like here where it has influence on 3, and it's a very aggressive army. So you can use screens and things like that. But when you look at it like this, there's 2 ways you can go about it. You can either get into the middle like this and start controlling a trifecta of objectives while essentially getting ready to push in and take this objective at the end of the game. Or you can stack it on one side and essentially move in to control 2 objectives very well, and then be able to push into this area later in the game. And that really depends on terrain, because if there's good terrain where you can hide behind, if your enemy is really shooty, you essentially forget this side of the board and you can move into this zone here and have a zone of control around this area of the battlefield, while then moving in to that area of the battlefield. The key here is, don't forget that there's very little room here. So your enemy puts something aggressive like Death Company or something here that can move up really quickly. You have to be ready to deal with threats right away. Alternatively, you can control this objective from 3 inches back here. So you don't need to be right up front. You can actually control it from behind, and that's up to you. Going first, going second, you know, that really changes the whole dynamic of the game with the new FAQ and things like that. But tactically, when there's 4 objectives, you're going to either hold one, and your opponent's going to hold one, or you're going to push to hold 3 and hold the enemy off while they only get to hold 1. And that's really just depends on how aggressive your list is, or if they're a close combat army versus a shooty army. You know, because even if they're a shooty army, you might not want to get into a central zone if they're back here and then just shooting you off the board. So that's something to keep in mind. So let's change the deployment zone into our second style of deployment, which will be hammer and anvil. So essentially what it does is it adds 6 inches to the distance between, you know, the 2 deployments, and then it evens out the deployment. AKA, it turns the lengthwise into not so lengthwise, which then allows you to essentially be a lot closer to this objective and that objective. So these 2 become equidistant, and in that case now what you've done is you create a zone of control. So you can do essentially the same thing, but it's a little harder if you're not as fast, because your enemy can be on the line here and can really put pressure on these 2 objectives. So in this case, I do prefer stacking one corner and pushing hard up this way in order to force my opponent that way and create some room that you get in the other deployment. So with hammer and anvil, where the deployments are very similar, you know, something like this, it just means that you essentially still need to kind of get creative with that as well. So there you go, hammer and anvil, which means these 2 become part of the middle of the board, and all of a sudden you have to get more aggressive on one side or the other. You can still go and get really aggressive in the middle, which is something you have to do when you play that 5 mission objective, which is the places of power or whatever, with the characters, and then you have a 5th one right in there. But these kind of go back a little bit further for that one as well. Okay, so let's change the deployment around and we'll continue our chat after. Okay, next deployment style is search and destroy, also colloquially known as table quarters. Table quarter number 1, table quarter number 2. 18-inch gap between the middle of the 2 deployments and like a 12-inch gap from corner to corner here. So in mission 3, what this does is it gives you access to 2 objectives right off the bat, which means that they'll have access to 2 objectives right off the bat. So this benefits armies that like to just sit there and can kill a lot of stuff, because they don't have to move more. They can just aim to kill more, and they don't really need to go and hold more. You know, if you have an element that can go up, you know, you can sort of threaten the closer objective to your deployment zone by kind of moving up and contesting it or something like that. If you go second, essentially losing out on that unit if you overextend it or whatever. Conversely, if you get very aggressive, you know, from corner of the deployment zone to the nearest objective here is only 14 to 15 inches. Same here to this side. So, you know, but if you go this way, it's 20 inches. So it's a lot easier to kind of push towards the closest objective here if you want to kind of turn this into a sort of hammer and anvil deployment. So if you strengthen the section that's close to the enemy objective, essentially you're threatening this whole zone. You know, for example, with Talos, a Talos threat range is 20 inches, which goes back here. So if you're putting a unit of Talos here, you're saying, hey, if you deploy anything near this unit or this objective, I can move 8 and then have a decent chance at completely clearing them out and taking that objective for you. So what you do is you essentially put your opponent on a bit of a back foot in order to try and either stay back or only hold one objective, or, you know, minimally take one objective while strengthening one. So it benefits you to be aggressive, to take an objective away from your enemy, as long as you don't kind of like trade objectives. You want to hold one objective, hold another objective. This one and this one, relatively easy to hold because they're a little further. but the ones closer to the enemy deployment zone, those are going to be the hard ones to keep. So in this deployment, you want to use terrain to your advantage to kind of push up or move up and then threaten the objectives that your enemy has. If you can throw them off balance, that allows you to flip the table in terms of gaining more points throughout the game, because that hold more can really come in handy, especially when it's an even number of objectives. If you can throw them off balance using objectives secured or clearing their objectives, these are easy to hold, so you have to really kind of crack them, get through, and take the objectives off of them. You know, conversely, this whole area is like dead zone, so you don't really want to go into here unless you want to bait the enemy into moving away from the objective, because it doesn't really give you much. And in this sort of deployment, having something like, you know, recon is really easy to get, because all you have to do is kind of move a guy in here, move a guy in here, and essentially have somebody threatening one of the objectives up here, or moving into this table quarter, which is only around here. And you don't have to overextend to get something like recon. But that's something to keep in mind. The next deployment style that we have is Vanguard Strike, because it's the most similar, so I'm going to set it up and then we'll talk about that one as well. And here we have Vanguard Strike. Little corner over here, little corner over there. As you can see, the objectives are relatively close in terms of they're right on the line of your zone. So in Vanguard Strike, it's very easy to zone out the back of the board and kind of keep this safe, right? You only need like a string of guys going out this way, you've zoned that out. And then you have these two objectives. Now this is where it gets creative. Depending on your opponent's deployment zone, you can either push hard for that objective, push hard for this objective, or if you can control a large front, push out for both objectives. It's a lot easier to get the bonus point in this mission. Why? Because you basically just have to get more objective secure models up here, and if you can move, then turn 2, turn 3, you can start forcing that bonus objective on your opponent. This is one of the easiest deployment styles to play this mission at, because you control 2 objectives, they control 2. Very similar to table quarters, but there's a decent amount of space in between, and you can deploy deep if you really, really need to. Kind of allow your opponent to come up if they're going first, and then counterattack to kind of turn the tide of the battle. So you have a lot of space. Something I like doing in this deployment is essentially pivoting from this objective here and using a pivot maneuver this way to essentially turn it into hammer and anvil. Protecting this objective here and then pushing into this objective over here, while maybe using some deep strikers to threaten this objective from that side over there. So in this case, a little bit simpler. It's more straightforward in my mind, even though the deployment's a little convoluted. But based on terrain, that could kind of show you whether you want to push this way or that way. But in terms of visualization, you can see how it's really about, you know, holding your 2 objectives and then pushing hard onto one objective. You don't want to overcommit in any sort of game like this. So we'll go on to the last 2 deployments, which is Dawn of War and Pointy Dawn of War. Haha! Pointy Dawn of War. So colloquially known as Pointy Dawn of War, it's front line assault. 6 inches on either side, up to a 15-inch point, which means there's about 18 inches in between the 2 points, and from corner to corner, you've got about 36 inches or so. Which means that you have control of this objective here. Very easy to kind of bubble and castle, especially with like a Vexter mask right in the middle, protecting from charges. Now, as Dawn of War, this sort of deployment style is all about deployment. So baiting your opponent out in terms of figuring out what their plan is. Because it's so linear, you have to understand if they're going to be putting all their strength on one side of the board or the other side of the board, or centrally, or spread out. So your job here, before you decide how to tackle the mission, is to understand deployment. So if you start deploying like a razor wing on one side and then a razor wing on the other side, and you basically put all your random stuff and don't give away much, you're trying to see if they're going to stack one side and push for either of these objectives, or they're going to come right at you in the middle. I prefer trying to hold this objective as well as I can, and then of course pushing towards one objective hard. and then flipping the table on my opponent. I don't care if they take an objective I'm not going for, they can have it as long as they're out of position for the end of the game. So really in this one, and you know, this ties in directly into regular Dawn of War, which is just 12 inches up. But what that does is it essentially increases the amount of space and decreases the distance in between the two table quarters on the side. Because when you have a regular Dawn of War deployment like this, all of a sudden it's 24 inches across the board instead of a skewed, you know, so you're getting more distance in the middle and less distance on the sides. And what this does is it makes it a lot easier to push towards one objective or another. But this doesn't change the fact that you need to understand deployment and you have to understand threat ranges. You know, a lot of the time, especially if you're facing something like gallants, and you know, an enemy puts a gallant and a gallant, or something that's very aggressive and moves really fast, I rarely use my entire deployment zone in Dawn of War. I'm usually deploying, you know, 4 or 5 inches into my back edge. You know, getting that extra 8 inches and forcing my opponent to move even further, I know that with a 2-inch move I'm going to be getting on my objective. I'm not worried about that. If I have enough speed, it means I can push in or use a move and a charge to get into either of these objectives. The key here is to deploy reactively and put your strength against your opponent's weakness. You know, do understand that some armies like Eldar can redeploy, so don't get, you know, if you have Eldar, you can kind of force your opponent's hand, you know, Wave Serpent, Wave Serpent, Wave Serpent, Fire Prism, Fire Prism, Fire Prism, you know, block of Guardians or whatever. And then depending on who goes first, you could go, okay, now I'm going to move all my Wave Serpents and put them on the other side of the board, or all my Fire Prisms and put them on this side of the board, and hit this side so hard that it just crushes that flank. And all of a sudden, all the stuff you put on this side of the board just has that much further to come to this side. So in this mission, especially with the last 2 deployments, it's all about that maneuvering. Because all you need to do is control 2 objectives, hold them, and it denies your opponent hold more. And then push up for a 3rd objective later in the game to get that hold more point later in the game, focusing on killing things and focusing on getting your secondaries, etc., etc. So I hope you guys found this from Mission 3 useful. If you have any comments or suggestions, make sure that you leave them down below. As a huge thank you to all the Patreons, I will continue to do this. You guys are freaking awesome, and I hope that this helps you increase your gameplay, especially in the ITC format. After all, I'm Skari, your grateful host, and I'm signing off until the next video. Skari out.